Hi again, Gregg, the News Tribune, talking live from Seattle after the most unique draft in the team's 46-year history for the Seahawks. They had just 3 picks this past weekend. That was by design. We'll get into that in a little bit on how they got to 3. That's the fewest in team history by 2. Fewest in the John Schneider, Pete Carroll era that began in 2010. The previous fewest was 8 picks. So they were less than half of what they had previously. Their fewest. They'd averaged 9.5 picks in their first 11 drafts. The 3 picks Seattle had this past weekend also were the fewest in the NFL since the 2009 New York Jets, the draft that they drafted Mark Sanchez. So this was absolutely unique for the team that usually wheels and deals its way into multiple more picks over the course of a weekend. The Seahawks had 2 trades during the draft, one to go down, one to go back up, but the net result was still just the same 3 picks that they entered the weekend with. Those 3 picks, Dwayne Eskridge was the second-round pick, their number 1 pick of this draft at 56th overall. He's a speedy wide receiver, 4'3" guy. He's a 5'9", not the prototype third wide receiver Pete Carroll usually has, but they are really impressed by how aggressive he is and how fast he is. He just blew by guys in the Mid-American Conference. We'll find out if he can do that in the NFL, a big jump. But that's what the draft is about, is for potential. The Seahawks needed a third wide receiver behind Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf. That's why Dwayne Eskridge is now the Seahawks. The second pick they had in the 4th round, Trey Brown. He's a 5'10" Oklahoma cornerback, played in the Big 12 where defense is usually pretty optional. And he gave up only 1 deep pass the entire season last year. In a conference, the team scored 60-plus points and would throw it 50-plus times a game. Brown's also, as you can see in the photo, a kick returner. He's a kickoff and punt returner at Oklahoma, and that's something that the Seahawks will explore him potentially doing. But they love his aggressiveness and his stocky body. He's 5'10", also breaking the Pete Carroll mold for a cornerback. But they love his toughness, his physicality, as well as his speed outside at cornerback. The Seahawks' 3rd and final pick, they drafted in the 6th round, trading up from the 7th round to get it. Stone, you got to love the name. Stone, that's right, Stone Forsythe. Look how big he is. I mean, that's not a middle school defensive end he's blocking against in the SEC. He's 6 feet 8.5. The Seahawks have him almost at 6'9". Played left tackle for Florida in the Southeastern Conference, reputed to be a very elite pass blocker, but not so much in the run game. Of course, pass blocking is exactly what Russell Wilson has said he wants more of in Seattle. So 3 picks obviously was not the biggest story in the league, nor remotely in the division. The biggest story in the division in the NFC West this draft this weekend, San Francisco, the 49ers, what they did, and it started last month when they traded up from 12th overall to 3rd overall in the draft. You knew they were going to get a quarterback to do that. They did. They took Trey Lance from North Dakota State, very inexperienced relative to most top quarterbacks drafted. But he's their new trigger guy. So now they have Trey Lance. So what's the immediate future for Jimmy Garoppolo? Is this the end of Garoppolo in San Francisco? Is half the NFC West starting quarterback brigade going to change this year? Well, that's why we have my McClatchy colleague, Chris Biderman. He's the 49ers reporter and writer from the Sacramento Bee. He joins us down from Northern California. First of all, I've got to say, Chris, congratulations on making it through Sunday alive. Sunday.
Thank you. That was very much in question based on what Kyle Shanahan said last week. But we all made it. Jimmy Garoppolo made it. He remains on the roster, and we can talk about what that means. But yeah, happy the draft is over. It's been a wild month down here in the Bay Area for sure.
A lot wilder than Seattle. Your snap reaction, Chris, on not just what happened in the draft this past weekend, but what San Francisco's done since season's end.
Yeah, the 49ers really did well in free agency. I think they did better than they anticipated, and obviously the big move was bringing back left tackle Trent Williams to that record-setting contract. It's basically 2 3-year deals. I'm looking at it as 1 3-year deal, and then let's sort of see what happens after those 3 years when the salary cap is expected to spike. They can void and rework the last 3 years of that deal. So the 6 years is sort of a misnomer. I think there are 3 sort of funny years on the back end to spread out the signing bonus. But The point being, they did well in free agency to where they didn't feel like they had to. They felt like they were in a position where they could go get their quarterback because they didn't have to address left tackle, which would have been a really pressing need had they not been able to retain Trent Williams. So they were able to get Trent Williams, and they looked at the landscape. I think they identified two quarterbacks in the draft that they liked that they could have gotten at 3. It's my belief that Lance and Mac Jones were absolutely those guys. There was much less chatter about Justin Fields to the 49ers. And when you look at just Lance and Jones's skill set, I think that makes sense. But so Kyle Shanahan had just gotten a contract extension last summer. So John Lynch had gotten a contract extension last offseason also. So the 49ers were in a position to where they could say, look, Jimmy Garoppolo's basically missed 2 of the last 3 years because of injuries. He's making a lot of money. We certainly can't anticipate that he's going to remain healthy if we roll him back as a starter in 2021. So let's get a guy we can develop for the future and potentially save us Jimmy Garoppolo's salary, and maybe we can invest some of that money in long-term extensions for guys like Fred Warner. Nick Bosa is going to be up for a contract here in the coming seasons, and that's not going to be cheap based on what his brother Joey just got with the Chargers this offseason. So the 49ers are looking at it like they can take the offense to a different level with a quarterback who's much more athletic, a stronger arm, has a unique skill set in comparison to Garoppolo. And they could also get that guy in a rookie contract, allowing them to build out the rest of the roster while they believe their championship window is open. So it's certainly a unique situation because the 49ers do consider themselves Super Bowl contenders, and there aren't many teams in NFL history that can say, they were 15 months removed from losing in the Super Bowl to the Chiefs, to taking a franchise quarterback with the number 3 overall pick. I think it's the earliest a team coming off a Super Bowl has ever drafted a quarterback in the top 5 in the common draft era. So it's a really, really big swing. Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch have a lot of conviction when it comes to Trey Lance, but as you said, he's very inexperienced. He's a younger guy, and so there are plenty of question marks about that and about the risk involved with the pick. But if you do believe in Kyle Shanahan, which the team's owner and CEO Jed York obviously does, if you believe in Kyle Shanahan's ability to develop quarterbacks, then you should be really optimistic about this pick, because Trey Lance, as many people have argued, probably has the highest upside of any quarterback in this class. And just when you look at the offense he's joining, the supporting cast, the coaching staff, I think that's a fair assessment to make about that number 3 pick.
So I think it was 317 pass attempts for Trey Lance, if I'm not mistaken. That's the fewest in a top 5 quarterback pick in maybe ever. What happened? It was Mac Jones, and Alabama's quarterback's coming to San Francisco, and that was supposed to be the most unpopular. I mean, you would have thought they were hiring Mike Nolan as their coach again. What happened? And that was all obviously smokescreen, but what was behind all that?
So it depends on who you believe, and this is sort of what I gather, and I think there was some clarity brought to the situation with the reporting from Albert Breer of Sports Illustrated and Peter King in his weekly column today. Or I guess that dropped last night. What my belief is, the 49ers saw Mac Jones and thought, okay, that's the baseline. That's the guy we would feel comfortable taking 3rd overall. Let's do this trade and let's spend the next month figuring out exactly what we like about each of these guys. And Trey Lance was certainly in that conversation too, but as you mentioned, it's a small sample size. It required more digging. It required more getting to know Trey Lance on a personal level through all the Zooms, through getting Kyle Shanahan's guy, John Beck, the quarterback guru, sort of serves as an extension of the coaching staff and maybe even the scouting department throughout this process, because there are no 30 in-person visits, right? There are no top 30s this year. You can't go out to dinner with guys. So you really need to back channel to figure out what makes these guys tick. And I think as they dove deeper into Trey Lance, they really started to like him. And you talk to people in the league about how intelligent he is, and his acumen, and his interpersonal skills, and his leadership traits, and just how he fit in the locker room in North Dakota State. And you see the videos of his teammates celebrating him getting drafted. I think he was sort of a beloved guy in that program. So the skill set and the tape sort of speaks for itself. But I think what really swayed Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch was just what kind of person they think they're getting with this pick. So in combination with the film, in combination with all the different ways that Kyle Shanahan could potentially use him, particularly in the running game, his second reaction ability, his ability to throw on the run, make a lot of plays outside of the structure of the offense, backyard football, which Seahawks fans are very used to with Russell Wilson. There was an element of, the 49ers quarterback room these last few years with Jimmy Garoppolo being hurt, especially. They didn't have quarterbacks that could elevate the guys around them. They were very stationary pocket guys who could run the system, but you get to a certain point in the NFL where being able to run the system just isn't enough, right? So now you get somebody potentially who might have a similar effect that Russell Wilson has on the Seahawks, in that if the roster isn't great, if the offensive line struggles, if the defense isn't playing up to the level that it would need to be, you're still going to be in the conversation for 10 or 11 wins just because you have a playmaking quarterback. So I think Kyle Shanahan just surveyed all of that, realized that, okay, our ceiling with Trey Lance, while it might be a riskier pick, our ceiling with Trey Lance is potentially higher, because if we do want to win the Super Bowl, we do have to beat guys like Patrick Mahomes and Aaron Rodgers and Russell Wilson and potentially Josh Allen. And then you can go down the list of quarterbacks who make a lot of plays outside of the structure of the offense. And you can easily see why Trey Lance fits in sort of this modern NFL. So I think if you believe in Kyle Shanahan and what he does offensively, the ceiling is awfully high for this pick, but you did mortgage the future to get him. So the 49ers are going to have some needs that they're not going to be able to fill in the draft, but maybe they're going to be an appealing destination in free agency, because they are going to have a little bit more money available and they are going to be a contending team. And they've sort of proven since Kyle Shanahan got here that they're a quote unquote destination for players looking to get highly paid and join a possible Super Bowl contender.
He's Chris Biderman, the 49ers beat writer for the Sacramento Bee. I'm Gregg Bell, the News Tribune Seahawks beat writer. We're live on our Bee and News Tribune Facebook channels, YouTube channels. We're going to get to your questions that are starting to pile up here. And in just a minute, I've done this for now I started covering the NFL 20 years ago, and I've learned that anything teams say in April are pretty much lies. And no matter what, there's a reason why they're telling you something, and it's usually to send you down or somebody else down the wrong path. And that's really what happened with Mack Jones ultimately in San Francisco. The question, obviously, the big question is, you trade 3 first-round picks, Chris. You draft a quarterback, number 3. You mentioned the 4-year window they have at a rookie contract, rookie salary with him to build the rest of the team. That's how the Seahawks got the back-to-back Super Bowls with Russell Wilson, right? He was on his rookie deal. You could go get Michael Bennett, re-sign him, get Cliff Averill, re-sign him, Richard Sherman, give him a new deal. That's a huge advantage. Patrick Mahomes in Kansas City, the same thing. Carson Wentz with the Eagles, Jared Goff with the Rams, all recent quarterbacks who they've won big when they've had rookie deals and they could build the rest of the team around. So are the 49ers really going to be willing to use 25% of that window of a rookie contract for a number 3 overall pick and make Trey Lance an understudy for Jimmy Garoppolo this year?
Yeah, Kyle Shanahan basically said, the first thing he wants to do is get Trey Lance on the practice field, given that he only played 1 game against Central Arkansas last year. And so he wants to see what he's like on the practice field before making any Jimmy Garoppolo determinations. And I think given the way the draft went with the Chicago Bears getting Justin Fields and, it seems like there are other potential quarterback destinations that seem to solve that problem through the draft, or at least help solidify it. And you look at the Denver Broncos too, getting Teddy Bridgewater. I don't know that necessarily precludes them from the Jimmy Garoppolo sweepstakes if they ever do get active in that market. But no, to me, I think it's just going to be a competition. I think the 49ers view it as they can just let this play out because the owner is willing. Jed York is willing to foot the bill for Jimmy Garoppolo, and the 49ers have incorporated Garoppolo's salary into their cap structure, so they feel okay about having to pay him this year. And Kyle Shanahan mentioned it at the time of the trade, like the ideal scenario is really what the Chiefs did in 2017 when they had Alex Smith and drafted Patrick Mahomes, basically sat him for 15 out of the 16 games that year, still went to the playoffs, and then traded Alex Smith in the offseason and made Patrick Mahomes a starter. Starting in 2018. So I think that's a very plausible scenario. I also think once training camp comes around, I do think Trey Lance is smart enough to potentially just gain a knowledge of the playbook that allows him to be well enough versed in the offense to unseat Jimmy Garoppolo as soon as training camp. I do believe that. I know a lot of the talking points surrounding Trey Lance coming in was that, well, he's inexperienced, he needs to sit for a year. I go back and forth on that because Kyle Shanahan does make things pretty easy on quarterbacks, right? Like he does as good a job as any offensive coordinator in the league at getting guys open and making clearly defined reads for quarterbacks. So I think, Trey Lance could potentially come in and start right away. And then you're adding that his athleticism to the offense and what you can do with him in the running game and play more 11-on-11 football, similar to what Baltimore does with Lamar Jackson. And I think Trey Lance is a very different player than Lamar Jackson, but you can do some of those similar things with quarterback powers. I think there are going to be 4 or 5 times a game, third and short, goal to go situations where you can really maximize Trey Lance's skill set and make him a valuable weapon in the running game that way, even if you don't give him 10 to 15 carries a game. I think that might be a little bit irresponsible of a way to use him because you don't want him taking all those hits, but you do want him to be a threat. So I think that you can make him a threat as early as week 1. Now, it's going to be up to Jimmy Garoppolo ultimately. If Jimmy Garoppolo comes in to training camp, plays really well, then I think the 49ers would have no problem sticking him out there week 1 as a starter because, when Jimmy Garoppolo has been healthy, the one full season he's played with Kyle Shanahan, they did go to the Super Bowl. He was the only quarterback in the NFL to be top 5 in completion percentage, touchdown throws, and yards per attempt. And a lot of that, of course, is because of how Kyle Shanahan schemes things and makes it easy on his quarterback, relatively speaking. And so it wouldn't surprise me if Garoppolo does end up being the starter for the first half of the season. But I ultimately think, I would be surprised if Garoppolo remains on the team by the trade deadline. I think we're going to get to a point where Trey Lance is clearly the better option. The 49ers invested all of those picks, like you said, in Trey Lance. So I could see that. Forcing the issue with Trey Lance pretty early because you do need to get him game reps. That's how you develop him, is get him those game reps after not being super experienced. So, it's going to be a fascinating training camp, but I think it's just going to be a competition, and the 49ers will be willing to start Jimmy Garoppolo if he wins the competition. But if he doesn't, then it wouldn't surprise me at all if Trey Lance is a starter. And then you see the 49ers try to figure out, is there a team? Does Denver still want Jimmy Garoppolo? I guess New England's out of that picture now that they drafted Mac Jones. But so you do wonder. I mean, I went into this draft thinking there wasn't much of a market for Jimmy Garoppolo anyway. Maybe that changes as the season goes. Maybe somebody gets hurt somewhere. But I think the 49ers have made it clear they're comfortable with Jimmy Garoppolo just being on the roster and competing for the starting job as of now.
There's a possibility, as you know, Chris, that the NFC West, the best division in football, the deepest, the most talented teams, top to bottom, will have half its quarterbacks turned over this year. The Rams already, back in the winter, way back in January, traded Jared Goff, their Super Bowl quarterback from a couple of years ago, to the Detroit Lions to get Matthew Stafford. And now you've got the San Francisco situation. That has Kyler Murray entering his 3rd year in Arizona, the number 1 pick in the draft a couple of years ago, and Russell Wilson. And Wilson now entering, 11th season, 10th season as the quarterback of Seattle. He's into his 30s now. He's got 3 years on his contract, including this one. Contract ends after 2023. He's by far now the elder statesman quarterback in the division. That's an advantage for Seattle, depending on how it plays out in San Francisco. Keep mentioning Garoppolo's contract and how tradable he is, Chris. What exactly is that contract? I can't see anybody picking up the money that he's owed, which is what a franchise quarterback that takes you to the Super Bowl gets.
Yeah, I think it would be, if he were to get moved, I think it would be a similar situation to Teddy Bridgewater where the contract was reworked at the time of the trade. So I would imagine, depending on what situation he goes to, the 49ers are going to end up paying a significant chunk of that salary. And then it'll make it more palatable for the Jimmy Garoppolo's new team to deal away some of those picks. So
what's that, $24 million or whatever?
Yeah, $24 million base salary. There's basically all of the guaranteed money has been paid to Garoppolo already. So there isn't going to be much of a dead cap hit. I think it's $1 million or $2 million over the next 2 seasons. So it's really not that bad at all, considering what for an example, what the Falcons are dealing with Matt Ryan, right? And the 40 million in dead cap that they would have to eat if they moved on from him. So the 49ers can move on from Jimmy Garoppolo. And like I said, given that they're willing to potentially roll into the season with him making that $24 million base salary, it would stand to reason they'd also be willing to pay some of his salary after he did get traded. So the in terms of where he goes, I sort of struggle with that thought right now. I continue to look at Denver because they do have close ties with, Adam Peters used to work there, the Niners assistant GM. John Lynch obviously cut his teeth in that front office a little bit, very close with John Elway. So, if they don't end up getting Aaron Rodgers and they're not happy with Teddy Bridgewater and clearly doesn't seem like they're all that thrilled with Drew Lock, it seems to me that might be a situation worth monitoring in terms of Garoppolo. But no, I do believe that it's going to take a contract restructure on top of the trade whenever that does happen, because, $24 million, while it's not a ton in the grand scheme of things, when you look around the league and see so many quarterbacks making 30, $35 million a year, but there's just the injury risk. And you can't, if you're a team, you can't pay $24 million if you're not absolutely certain your guy's going to play the vast majority of games. So that'll be the big question mark, but I'm expecting if and when he does get traded for that contract to get reworked.
And that's a $24 million is a bigger number this year than it would have been last year or next year, because the salary cap's gone down. It's gone from 198 to 183. So teams have less to spend and are less willing to devote sizable percentages of their cap space, adding on, in the case of the trade, an unforeseen cap charge as Garoppolo's would be. Here's the thing on Lance. He's not Trevor Lawrence going to Jacksonville, or he's not Joe Burrow going to Cincinnati. He's going to a team that went to the Super Bowl 2 years ago that is still loaded. It still has George Kittle at tight end, and they just re-upped in running back. And they've, as you mentioned, Trent Williams at left tackle, and they drafted for right guard, the one big hole they had on the offensive line. Their defense is still ferocious with Bosa and Armstead, and they are loaded. They just happened to be hurt last year. Mm-hmm. They probably win, or at least certainly would have contended much more for the division had they not been hurt last season. And, of course, they went to the Super Bowl 2 years ago. You mentioned Garoppolo's big year, but the entire team was healthy. And that's usually what it takes to get to the Super Bowl. But it's not like Lance. If you throw Lance in this season, it's not a sink or swim, trial by fire season for him at all. He's got a cast that very few number 3 overall picks have ever had in the league.
Yeah, and I think you can look at the rest of the draft, the rest of the Niners draft class, to sort of see which direction this could potentially be going, right? Because, Kyle Shanahan hadn't drafted a running back since 2017, and that was Joe Williams, a guy who never played a snap for them. And so they've been really rolling with some free agents and some sorry, I'm getting a little echo in my headphones. They were rolling with, free agent guys and guys they had drafted, and but now they draft, in the third round. Well, in the second round, they draft Aaron Banks, a right guard who you mentioned should really help in the running game. A massive 325-pound guy, somebody who really lends to maybe more of a gap style rushing attack, which Trey Lance did a lot of. As they ran a lot of QB power at North Dakota State. So you could see that fitting in. Round 3, they traded 2 fourth-round picks for Ohio State running back Trey Sermon, who seems like a guy that could potentially complement Raheem Mostert. He doesn't necessarily have the breakaway speed, but still a very good athlete, still really good change of direction. Somebody who I think they could count on potentially for 12 to 15 carries a game, in addition to all the other weapons they have in the running game. And then a 6th-round pick, Elijah Mitchell, from Louisiana Lafayette, who's another one that, he ran 4.33 at his pro day. I don't think he played that fast, and I think he did drop a little bit of weight to get to that speed. But, in the 6th round, just the fact that Kyle Shanahan drafted 2 running backs after not drafting any since 2017 really speaks to, all right, if we throw Trey Lance in there, there's no doubt that we are going to be able to run the football. And so you look at, what happened on defense. Richard Sherman likely not coming back. DeForest Buckner being a member of the Indianapolis Colts. You wonder if the 49ers are going to try to make up for maybe some a little bit of regression to the mean on defense. If they make up for that by playing a ground control not turning the ball over. Trey Lance only threw one interception in his entire college career, and none in 2018, and 287 pass attempts. So you just look at the fact that he drafted running backs, added to the offensive line. They signed Alex Mack in free agency. He's not the guy he was a few years ago when he was, an all-decade team member, but he's still a very good center and a significant upgrade over their situation last year. So coming out of it, they're going to be able to run the ball. And I think that's what, to your point about the situation he's getting dropped into, they're not going to be a team that drops back 35 times a game, at least this season if Trey Lance is a starter. They're going to run the ball really effectively. They're going to run a lot of play action, and I think there are going to be a lot of open receivers for Trey Lance. And so just, two running backs, they dealt with a ton of injuries at running back last season. The right guard position was a huge area of concern, and now they get a mauling run blocker there who's probably going to start from day one, a guy they drafted in round 2. So they're going to be able to run the ball, and I think that's the way that they integrate Trey Lance early, is just being able to run the ball and put him in very advantageous positions to where you're not asking him to throw the ball 40 times a game from shotgun.
The Seahawks could sure use Alex Mack at center right now. They actually looked at possibly signing him, and they're going to go with. Go ahead.
I do want to ask you about the Seahawks, because I know this is streaming in your neck of the woods. So from the outside looking in, it seems like, you talk to people around the league and everybody's concerned about Russell Wilson's status with the team, and can that dysfunction manifest negatively into losses between the lines. And I
thought you'd never ask about Russell Wilson's future. I'm shocked. I'm not prepared.
Well, it's a pretty big storyline. But, having covered the 49ers during the Jim Harbaugh years and just seeing how some of those off the field tensions can lead into, wins and losses, I'm just curious what your opinion is on that dysfunction and whether or not it will impact what happens between the lines when the Seahawks suit up this fall.
Well, Chris, it's easy to think there's dysfunction after what you read and saw all off season. I can tell you, one, the Seahawks were never going to trade Russell Wilson. Written that, have said that. That was never in the cards. And what most of this offseason was about was leverage. It was leveraging on the part of a baseball agent that Russell Wilson has, primarily a baseball agent, who's used to dealing with guaranteed contracts and a little bit of public perception and leverage and lining up for the next big deal. I mentioned Wilson's contract expires after the 2023 season. His agent, Mark Rogers, is already looking toward that. The Seahawks have made Russell Wilson the highest paid player in the NFL twice, once after his rookie deal for his extension, and then his third contract with the Seahawks, $140 million signed a few years ago. They want that and more again this next time in 2023, and this is all a play toward that. They want the perception to be that Wilson's not an automatic guarantee to re-sign with Seattle, as much as he goes to Children's Hospital every Tuesday, as much as he bought a home on the water in Bellevue, and how he's so ingrained in the community here, and they've made it their home, one of their many homes he and Sierra have. They want the perception to be that it's not a foregone conclusion that he's here forever. And that Seattle, you need to upgrade the offensive line. You need to get him better pass protection, get hit less often. You need to let him in on some of these big moves they're going to make, like hiring the offensive coordinator from the Rams, the passing game coordinator from the Rams, Shane Waldron, to be a first-time offensive coordinator. They've done that. Wilson's firing a salvo here very publicly for him this offseason, very unusual for him to state, I'm frustrated with getting hit too much. I asked him point blank 2 days after the Super Bowl. We were on a call, the Walter Payton Man of the Year Award conference call, and it was kind of funny. The NFL PR woman kept saying, please limit your questions to the Walter Payton Man of the Year, even though we had all written that story the previous 2 days. So we all asked him about his comments that he was frustrated with the Seahawks. And I point blank asked him, are you frustrated with the Seahawks? And he said, I'm frustrated with getting hit too much. Since then, the Seahawks have hired Shane Waldron to be their offensive coordinator to bring the Rams' quicker passing game based more on the run and get the ball out more quickly from his hands so that the pass blockers who have struggled for years in Seattle don't have to pass block as long. That's essentially what that schematic change will be. Then they traded for Gabe Jackson, a draft pick to the Raiders, to get what has been one of the better pass-protecting guards in the league the last half dozen years. Then this past weekend, they draft a 6'9" left tackle who's one of the best pass blockers in the SEC. Now, normally you say a six-round pick is not – well, a six-round pick in this year when you only have 3 picks is going to get a chance. Dwayne Brown is 35 years old. He's entering the last year of his contract. He's probably not going to come back in 2022. Now Brown has a year to mentor Stone Forsythe, their new left tackle they got in the 6th round this past weekend, and that's what he will do. So now they have a potential heir. If Forsythe is as good as in the NFL as he was in the SEC at pass blocking, that's exactly what Russell Wilson wants, a pass blocker. And for years, this offensive line was built on Run Mauler, DJ Fluker, J.R. Sweezy, just road graders for the run game. Well, we've seen now with the Gabe Jackson trade and now drafting Stone Forsythe, the Seahawks shift. People say Pete Carroll won't shift and change. Well, he's changing. He's changing his play caller and offensive coordinator to a quicker passing game, not as based on the long deep ball as last year with Brian Schottenheimer. And now he's changed to bring in 2 pass blockers over run blocking. So he has listened to Russell Wilson. And that really is the upshot of this offseason and what Wilson was yelling about being frustrated. All the other stuff, Chris, is leverage. All the 4 teams he'd be traded to. We don't want to be traded. They don't want to trade him. But if they would want to trade him, here's 4 teams we traded to. That was all leveraged by the agent to create an illusion that he would leave if given the opportunity. The Seahawks, from the owner on down, are devoted to Russell Wilson. I mean, Jody Allen has inherited from her late brother Paul the same mantra of let the football guys do their football things and hands off. They're supporting of Pete Carroll running the system as the executive vice president above even the general manager, John Schneider. He's the highest football authority, highest authority of any kind in the franchise beside the owner and chair, Jody Allen. And he, Carroll, and Schneider have cast their lot with Russell Wilson. And that's where they are. And as long as they are here in Seattle, it's Russell Wilson as their quarterback, and they have no plan B. And that includes beyond 2023. Both Carroll and Schneider have recently extended their contracts beyond Russell Wilson's contract. So the plan is to keep paying him and give him the weapons he needs and now the pass protection he needs to do that. And that really is the upshot of all of this. And now the one tangible effect that comes out of this, Chris, is Wilson's going to have some talking to do in the locker room when training camp starts. He's not like he was when he first got here. He's got young players, and predominantly younger than he, that look up to him as the team leader, young 20-something-year-old guys, 23, 24-year-old guys who follow social media, who think InstaChat and Snapgram are the be-all, end-all, and that's where the news sources are. Those guys think if it's on social media, it's true. And we all know the pitfalls of that. But the perception is that Wilson's not happy and wants out on social media. So Wilson has to address that and will. And actually, I asked Carroll about that last week in his pre-draft talk. And he said, that's already happened on our Zoom calls and our off-season work, that Wilson has talked to the players about that. And he's talked to Dwayne Brown. Before he talked about needing better pass protection, he went to Dwayne Brown and told him what he was going to do and where he was. And Brown, at this point in his career, he doesn't feel thrown under a bus and all that other stuff. Dwayne Brown's 35 years old with tens of millions of dollars in the bank and looking the rest of his life. He doesn't care about what Russell Wilson's saying and his agent's saying. So I think all of that has been blown way out of proportion. The bottom line is Russell Wilson's the same place he's been for 9 years and is under contract to be for the next 3, and that's the quarterback of the Seahawks for 2021, 2022 until 2023 at least.
So what do you make of let's go to the other side of the ball then, because I know, with only 3 draft picks, there wasn't, and only one defensive player among those 3, there wasn't really an opportunity to, I guess, replenish the roster with defensive guys after the Legion of Boom obviously left years ago. But, it seemed like the Seahawks did a lot of their work in free agency, and 2 guys in particular that I'm pretty familiar with, in Kerry Hyder and Ahkello Witherspoon. I'm just curious your thoughts as to, the Seahawks ranked 22nd in defense last year. So what have they made all the necessary steps to have a defense good enough to get them to a Super Bowl in a pretty competitive NFC, and just how do you view that side of the ball in terms of what the plan was this offseason?
No, Chris, they haven't. They're still very thin at corner. Ahkello Witherspoon has only signed a 1 year, $4 million guaranteed, tells you he's probably going to play, but it's only for 1 season. They lost both their starting corners in free agency, Shaquille Griffin and Quentin Dunbar. They only had Dunbar for 1 season, and it was part of 1 season because he was injured last year. DJ Reed, another guy you're familiar with, a waiver pickup. The 49ers waived injured last September and tried to sneak through waivers. The Seahawks took him on layaway and put him on an injured list for 2 months. Came in November and was an absolute revelation for them. First as nickelback, then as a 5'9" corner that Carroll's not supposed to use. He said, Carroll, this past weekend, that DJ Reed's play so aggressive outside. By the end of last season, he was a starting outside cornerback because of Dunbar's injury, that Reed opened his eyes to what a smaller cornerback can do. And that is why they drafted Trey Brown of Oklahoma in the 4th round this past weekend, because of DJ Reed. Trey Brown can thank DJ Reed for being on the Seahawks right now, because Carroll, who's usually a 6'2", 6'3", Richard Sherman prototype guy, 32-inch arms, he famously has never drafted a cornerback with shorter than 32-inch arms. Well, Trey Brown doesn't even have 30-inch arms. He's a 5'10" guy, and because of DJ Reed last year, Trey Brown is a Seahawk and drafted with a chance to be an outside corner. That's an unproven thing in Carroll's system. 5'9" and 5'10" corners, rookies, and DJ Reed with half a season of starting experience. Teams are going to target that. Their defensive line got a lot worse when Jaron Reed left in a salary cap dispute and a salary cap savings of $14 million. That's a big hole next to Poona Ford at defensive tackle. They are much thinner on the inside of the defensive line. The teams are like San Francisco are going to run right at that and exploit that and test that early and often this season. And then they have a KJ Wright situation at linebacker. They thought he was going to be signed either with themselves or some other team by now. Their longest tenured player is still unsigned and still out there in free agency. He may come back, but Carroll dropped the fact that maybe Darrell Taylor could be, instead of a Leo pass rushing end, their 2nd-round pick from last year who still hasn't played after leg surgery. They're envisioning he perhaps could drop into coverage and be an outside linebacker if they need him to be. Bruce Irvin was supposed to be the strong side linebacker. He had season-ending knee injury last year. He had another knee surgery in the winter, and he's unsigned and his career's in limbo. So they have no real answer right now at strong side linebacker. They have Jordan Brooks, their number 1 pick from last year, to be the weak side next to Bobby Wagner. But those are 3 key holes there, right up the middle, and on the outside, cornerback being the most vulnerable position in the game already. So I think defensively, they've got some vulnerabilities. And we also mentioned the fact already that they haven't upgraded at center. It'll be Kyle Fuller and Ethan Posick again at center battling for a starting job. Posick, the starter last year. Fuller was a exclusive rights free agent they just re-signed. Those are 2 good holdovers from last year. They didn't get any better at center. Could bring the 2 guys back. So they've got some issues that they didn't address because they only had 3 picks. The rest of the division, the Rams, to me, what was telling about the Rams, Chris, I don't know how you feel about LA's draft. The Rams, 3 of their first 4 picks were defensive picks. And on a defense that's already loaded with all-world Aaron Donald and Rockers and all those guys that can get after the quarterback and dominate up front, they go defense 3 of the first 4. Their most interesting pick to me was Robert Rochelle, the tall, long Pete Carroll prototype corner from Central Arkansas. They drafted him in the 4th round. They already have Jalen Ramsey down there. So they restocked on defense, and the defense was already pretty good. Arizona, for 5 of their first 6 picks were on defense, and 5 of their 7 overall were defensive players. But Rondale Moore is the one offensive player among the first 6, wide receiver from Purdue. He's 5'7". I mean, smaller than Tyler Lockett small, yet he's going to go into Cliff Kingsbury's air raid wide open offense with Kyler Murray and yet another weapon for him. Look out for Rondale Moore in the NFC West this year.
Yeah, I think the NFC West is clearly the best division in football right now. And I find it fascinating that you do have Matthew Stafford down there now. A lot of the discussion pre-draft regarding the 49ers and whether or not they would take an elite talent at quarterback. A lot of people, including Daniel Jeremiah, said, look, if you run that system, you have a pretty high floor just in terms of what you can accomplish through the way those coaches, including, of the Kyle Shanahan tree, which Sean McVay obviously is part of. And now the Seahawks are running a version of that with their new offensive coordinator, like you mentioned. But an elite talent at quarterback within that system can take that offense to a different level. So you wonder, Matt Stafford hasn't had a whole lot of success in terms of winning in playoff games won with Detroit, but how much is he to blame for that versus how much of that is just what happened in Detroit, and how does that new environment in LA change his value that people have of him throughout the league? Is he, I think a lot of people believe he's one of the most talented quarterbacks in the league, but now you get him with a good supporting cast, a good play caller, and maybe now he could really elevate himself to one of those guys you talk about when you talk about quote unquote elite quarterbacks. And so look, Arizona's a big wild card in my opinion. They could be that team that makes a jump and wins 11, 12 games, or they could also be a team that goes 6-11. I still got to get used to the fact there's 17 games, and now you have to reformulate the records in your head. But they're sort of that team that, I guess it just depends on how injuries go, whether or not they can get a great season out of JJ Watt, and can AJ Green, sort of resuscitate his career given all the injuries he's dealt with in recent seasons. That's a fascinating team just because it seems like there's such a wide variety of outcomes on the table for them. Is Cliff Kingsbury a good coach? We know he runs a pretty potent offensive system, but just in terms of coaching and in-game management and all of those things, I think those are questions that Cliff Kingsbury still needs to answer. And frankly, this could be a make or break season for him. If they do not take that next step and really elevate themselves into a playoff contender, is Arizona are they going to go find a new coach? And what's that going to mean for Kyler Murray and all of these weapons that we talk about with them? And then, Seattle's just, as long as Russell Wilson's there, Seattle's always going to be in the mix. So they're a fascinating team because there is that push and pull between, how much is he going to elevate what's around him, and how much is to your point, how much is the front office going to be able to build the roster around him so they can be consistently in that Super Bowl contention mix, as opposed to just a team, sort of in that playoff contention mix. Can they get there? Can they get over the top? And a lot of that's going to come down to Pete Carroll and John Schneider's ability to replenish the roster. And then you have San Francisco, a team that went to the Super Bowl 2 years ago, that was devastated by injuries. I think you look at the rest of the NFC and you can make the case that the 49ers still have one of the most talented rosters, but there are still questions, right? Because now you don't really know what to expect at quarterback this year, because no rookie has ever started in the Super Bowl, let alone win one. So if the 49ers do fancy themselves championship contenders, is it going to be with Jimmy Garoppolo or Trey Lance? Like I said earlier, I tend to think Trey Lance is going to be starting sooner rather than later, because you need to give him those game reps to develop. So, and they have a first-time defensive coordinator in DeMeco Ryans, somebody who's been around on the coaching staff as a linebackers coach. I think the system's going to be similar, but we haven't even gotten to speak with him yet since he got hired. So that's a big wild card. Like, are the 49ers just going to have a really good offense because the defense is going to take a significant step back now that Robert Saleh is the head coach of the New York Jets and not coordinating the defense? How healthy is Nick Bosa going to be coming off that ACL tear? He's posted videos on social media where he looks really good, but what does that mean really? He's not. We have no idea about his ability to play football at this point, just given the injury. And then there's Dee Ford's status. Is he going to play again? He's coming off a significant back injury that caused him to miss the final 15 games of last season. So it's a fascinating division because you can make the case for all four teams getting in, having double-digit win seasons and really pushing to represent the NFC in the Super Bowl. But obviously we know that's not true with, four teams. Like only two or three are going to make it, right? And realistically. So who's going to be the team that doesn't live up to expectations? I tend to think that's Arizona right now based on what we know. But, the 49ers were favorites in the NFC last year, and then they, famously finished last in the division because they were decimated by injuries. So you never know what's going to happen in the league, and that's what makes it so fascinating. But I'm really looking forward to how this season plays out in the NFC West, because it is such a talented division, and a lot of good coaches, a lot of good quarterbacks, and there should be a lot of parity, and each division game will be a lot of fun, I think.
The Seahawks are glad Robert Saleh's out of the division, I can tell you that. And Arizona's loaded. I mean, they really have reloaded nicely, talent-wise, in the desert. Okay, you've heard us talk for a while now. Let's get to the reader questions just piling up. You post them here online. We're live on the SACB and the News Tribune's Facebook and YouTube channels as well. Mike Wyman wants to know from online that the Seahawks had the fewest available draft picks this year. Yes, 3. Can you share what happened with those missing picks over the last few years, whether their loss was worth the risk of trading them away? Well, they had 8 picks, as I mentioned. They traded for Jamal Adams last summer. They gave up 2 picks this year, the first round and third round, and a first-round pick next year for Jamal Adams because he's an all-pro still in his early 20s. Will that be worth it? Well, that'll be determined by whether they can re-sign Jamal Adams after this year. His contract ends after 2021. If they don't re-sign him, and it's going to take the highest, richest contract in the NFL among safeties to do it, $16 million plus a year. If they don't do that, then there was a failure. The cost that they gave up. You can argue, and rightly so, that it's a high cost anyway for a safety. But he had 9.5 sacks last year, the most by in NFL history by a defensive back in a season. Yet he gave up quite a bit in that risk-reward type of play. The Seahawks defense wants to not have to blitz as much. That's why they have Carlos Dunlap. That's why they signed Kerry Hyder. That's why they brought Benson Mayowa back. They hope Darrell Taylor, their top pass rusher pick from last year, can be healthy to play this year. They hope they don't have to blitz Adams as much. They'd rather him not have 9.5 sacks because 90% of the time when he blitzed, he didn't have sacks, which means 90% of the time the back door was open on the Seahawks deep pass defense. So that alone, that trade alone, 2 number ones, 2 picks this year, a first and a third, was why the Seahawks went from 8 to 5, and then they traded for Gabe Jackson, and then they made the Carlos Dunlap trade in the middle of last season. That's how they went from 8 picks down to 3. What are the chances of Ethan Posick kicking over to left guard in Seattle this year? Jerron Kahn at yahoo.com wants to know. Not very likely now that Pete Carroll said this weekend that Damian Lewis, the starting right guard last year as a rookie third-round pick, is going to be the left guard this year. And Jackson, who's played right guard recently with the Raiders, is going to be staying at right guard, his more familiar position. So Posick is going to battle at center with Kyle Fuller, as I mentioned earlier, to see who can start there. Both of them are on the last years of their contract. They brought back Posick for just 1 year and $3 million. Ultimately, Posick may prove to be more valuable as a swingman. He was a backup tackle and a backup guard to begin his career. Last year was the first one at center in the NFL. He was at center at LSU when they drafted him in the second round 4 years ago. But Posick's back to be perhaps a jack of all trades on the offensive line and give Kyle Fuller a chance. But again, I think that's a big hole in that offense. Russell Wilson wanted upgrades to his offensive line. He got one at guard with Gabe Jackson, but he didn't get one with the same returning cast from 2020 coming back at center. We get a question from Mike Jones wants to know where the chances Stone Forsythe turns into an NFL lineman. Well, he is one right now officially after the Seahawks signed him to draft him in the 6th round. He's going to get a year to understudy under Dwayne Brown. Brown is still the best offensive lineman Seattle has. He's 35 years old, as I mentioned, going into the last year of his contract. They drafted Forsythe to see if he can be the heir apparent at left tackle. That's what he played at Florida. As I mentioned, an elite pass protector, 488 dropbacks Kyle Trask in that offense in Florida did last year. That many sacks, 2 that Forsythe gave up in 500 dropbacks. That's pretty darn good in the Southeastern Conference, not like he's going against tomato cans there in the defensive end pass rushers. So Forsythe's going to get a shot. Unlike most 6th-round picks this early in his career, it may not be this year, but the Seahawks, they need more than 5 offensive linemen. Every team does. Seattle used 7 different combinations of starting offensive line in their front 5 last year. So you're going to need guys like Stone Forsythe to be ready to play this year. They still have Cedric Ogbuehi, who could be a backup at right tackle to Brandon Shell. Shell's going into the last year of his contract. They signed him to a 2-year deal from the Jets last year. So I wouldn't say Forsythe was just a throw-in at all to this draft. When you have 3 picks, you're going to intend to use every one of those 3. From San Francisco, you mentioned the offensive line. Alex Mack's going to help them. Williams is a stud, but also getting a little older at left tackle. Where are they a year or 2 from now there?
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see. You know, I do think Aaron Banks, the All-American guard they drafted from Notre Dame at pick 48 in the 2nd round, I feel pretty confident saying he's going to be a week 1 starter. And that was really their biggest issue along the offensive line last year was at right guard. And they had center issues too. And Daniel Brunskill is a guy who started the year at right guard, had to play center. And they just, like you mentioned, the 49ers also had to start 7 different combinations along the offensive line, and they had 4 different starters at center throughout last year. So getting Alex Mack should solidify that as long as he stays healthy. And then Aaron Banks is somebody who started 31 straight games to finish his career at Notre Dame. So they're really banking on durability from his standpoint. And then Jalen Moore is an interesting player from Western Michigan, a guy they got in the 5th round. Somebody who Kyle Shanahan said could potentially play tackle and guard. He played tackle at school, but maybe projects more closely to a guard in Kyle Shanahan's offense. But just getting somebody like that, and he's also very durable. I think he had 30 starts to end his career, something in that neighborhood. So durability was really key. And so getting Jalen Moore potentially adds depth for them for sure, which they've needed because they've had depth issues along the offensive line with, Daniel Brunskill is a former undrafted player. Justin School is a guy who played a lot at tackle while the 49ers were dealing with injuries and kicked inside to guard some, but he was a 6th-round pick a couple years ago. And then Colton McKivitz last year, I believe, was a 5th-round pick out of West Virginia, somebody who played a lot of tackle, but they think he might be better at guard. But really, there are no solid answers for any of those guys, which is another way of saying we don't know if these guys are good enough and we trust them if they need to be a starter down the road. So getting Aaron Banks in round 2 should solidify that right guard spot. Getting Jalen Moore in round 5, I think he might be their best backup offensive lineman right now, just in terms of talent. We'll have to see how that all fits, but he also might be somebody who's in that mix for the swing tackle role. And they do have a couple candidates for that. Sean Coleman is somebody who opted out of last season and hasn't played a whole lot. Somebody the 49ers think has starter potential, but he's a pretty big question mark because he missed basically all of 2019 with a fractured ankle suffered in the preseason. So he's still sort of a question mark. And so what the 49ers offensive line looks like going forward, I think Trent Williams is pretty much entrenched in that left tackle spot as long as he's there. And like I said, 6-year contract, more like 2 3-year deals. And then you have Laken Tomlinson, a former 1st-round pick. I believe his contract's coming up after this upcoming season. I would have to double check on that. But maybe Jalen Moore is somebody you slide in there if you don't want to pay Laken Tomlinson again. Alex Mack, the center position is something that I thought the 49ers would have addressed in this draft. And looking at that right guard spot, I thought there might have been some centers that they could have drafted to play right guard and then switch to center after Alex Mack inevitably retires whenever that happens. But they didn't do that. They went with a traditional right guard in Aaron Banks. So center remains a question mark sort of in the long-term future, but I think Kyle Shanahan said it after the draft that they'll address that problem when it arises. They have plenty of confidence in Alex Mack for right now. And then Banks at right guard. Mike McGlinchey at right tackle is interesting because the team just picked up his 5th-year option. He was the 9th overall pick in 2018. A guy who played pretty well in his first 2 seasons and has been one of the best run-blocking tackles in football, but really struggled in pass protection last year. Took a pretty significant step back and a pretty public step back. There was he would go on social media and read a lot of the negative things people were saying about him, and it seemed like it affected him mentally. And obviously that's not something you want from an NFL guy to let, the reaction of fans on social media impact his play. And I think he's, one of those guys, very intelligent, and might overthink things at times. And so seeing that reaction on social media isn't the best thing, but the 49ers are still confident in what he can be as a player. I think when they drafted him, they viewed him as another version of Joe Staley, somebody that they might be able to count on for a decade plus to be, a linchpin along that offensive line. But last year was a little bit concerning given those struggles in pass protection. So he'll be a guy who's under the microscope right now because, if everybody else plays up to their capabilities and this Aaron Banks kid comes in and continues his All-American play, a former teammate of Mike McGlinchey in school, by the way.
Notre Dame.
Yeah, if he plays well, then you start to look at Mike McGlinchey like, is Mike McGlinchey the weak link along this offensive line? Is that really going to be a problem for them? I know they're going to run the ball, like I said, but
they must like Mike McGlinchey, Chris, because nowadays teams don't often pick up 5th-year options on 1st-round picks. It's expensive. It's guaranteed money. The new collective bargaining agreement says that not only if you pick up a 5th-year option on a guy, not only do you have to guarantee his next year, 2022 in this case, you have to guarantee the current season's salary too. Yep. And so that's a double investment. the Seahawks made the decision today, and it was not a surprise, to not pick up Rashad Penny's fifth-year option on that same draft. McGlinchey went to San Francisco. Penny's barely been on the field the last 15, 18 months, so they're not going to pay him $6.5 million guaranteed for this year and next, $4.5 of it next year on a fifth-year option. So McGlinchey getting the fifth-year option says where San Francisco thinks he is.
Yeah, but he's a team captain type guy.
Right.
Like, they view him as somebody who can talk to the media and be sort of out front, outspoken, one of those type of players.
Another one for you, Chris. Andrew Stanton on Facebook said, 49er fan here, Adam Schefter said the 49ers thought Lance was closer to starting in the NFL than Jones. Of course, Adam Schefter said that the Seahawks are going to trade Russell Wilson. What do you make of Schefter saying that Lance is closer to starting in the NFL than Mac Jones?
It's not surprising given what you hear, like I mentioned earlier, just about Trey Lance and his acumen and the way he thinks about the game. He gets really high marks from everybody you talk to just about what goes on in his head and the way he's able to articulate the game. And look, I think given what Kyle Shanahan puts on the plate of his quarterbacks, just in terms of, pre-snap protections, being under center, really long play calls in terms of verbiage, and everything else you hear about what Kyle Shanahan looks for, he really wants, in my opinion, somebody who he can match wits with, somebody who can be that extension of him on the field. And I think that's why a lot of people point to, Kirk Cousins, Matt Ryan, Matt Schaub, all of these guys. One thing all those guys have in common is they can think about the game in a similar way to Kyle Shanahan. And so for Kyle Shanahan to invest 3 first-round picks in somebody like Trey Lance, I think that indicates that Trey Lance can match wits with Kyle Shanahan and be an extension of Kyle Shanahan's thinking on the field under center. So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me at all if Trey Lance is a lot closer to starting than I think people think, and certainly the draft media thinks. I think just what makes the bridge easier to cross is the ability to do all of those things in the running game I alluded to earlier, where you're playing 11-on-11 football. And not that you need to have him carry the ball 15 times a game and take all of those hits, but at least use him as a decoy, at least utilize those legs on 3rd and 3 in the fourth quarter of a 1-score game, right? You can do all those things with Trey Lance, set up play action, make life easier for him just in terms of what he's looking at. I'm obviously not anticipating him to be in shotgun with 4 wide receivers and making all sorts of reads. That's not the player he's going to be initially, but we've seen it before. We saw it with RG3. The 49ers saw it with Colin Kaepernick back when he first became the starter in 2012, that you can orchestrate an offense that heavily relies on the running game and the quarterback's running element to it. And then it sort of simplifies everything else because that can be such a threat. So reinforcing the running game, getting Trey Sermon, getting Elijah Mitchell, the running back in the 6th round, to me, that signals the 49ers are going to try to run the ball. And given the success they've had in recent seasons, I tend to think they're going to be good at it. Now the question is, can Trey Lance come in and orchestrate the offense, make the plays necessary with his arm to stay in the starting lineup? Because I think the way you develop him, I've said it a couple times, is just giving him those reps. So Jimmy Garoppolo would have to be much better, in my opinion, than Trey Lance throughout training camp in the preseason to just be given the starting job, given the massive investments the 49ers just made. And so I think that pro readiness might have been overstated, at least when it came to Mac Jones and, you don't trade 3 picks for a guy that you have to develop. I never really bought that, but I also never really bought the idea that Trey Lance was this massive project, given he did play with his back to the defense a lot in a pro-style offense at North Dakota State, where he was in charge of making all those protections. So no, if Trey Lance won the starting job out of training camp, that wouldn't surprise me at all. He has to do it. We haven't seen him on the practice field yet. We're going to get our first look in a couple weeks at rookie minicamp. So he still has a lot of stuff to do to get to that point. But the 49ers don't make that investment in the guy if they don't think he can get to that point as soon as this summer.
Their draft, probably the NFC West draft, is going to be determined by Trey Lance's success here in the next few years.
Yep.
Chris, thanks for joining us from California. All of you online, thanks for joining us as well. Hey, if you like what you saw, like what you heard, like our coverage, like what we had to say, subscribe. We've got mouths to feed and mortgages to pay, and that's the way it is in the online and journalism world today. Go to thesacb.com, thenewstribune.com, and subscribe and get all our coverage of the 49ers and the Seahawks on there. Thanks for watching. Appreciate you. Appreciate all your following throughout what never is really an off season in the NFL. Take care.